is Dr. Danny Faulkner. He's an astronomer with Answers in Genesis in the US. And he did teach at the university at Lancaster. I'm going to say North Carolina, Danny?
Nope, you got it wrong. South Carolina.
South Carolina.
It's the good Carolina.
In the South. Should always remember that, in the South. Yeah, he taught at South Carolina for 26 years. I know that's right. For 26 years, he taught at South Carolina University in Lancaster, and he's served now for a number of years with Answers in Genesis in the US. But we're going to be looking tonight at the subject of the space program, NASA, and their search for life beyond Earth. And so it's quite an interesting topic. I know a lot of people are interested in this and have questions about it. And we'll look at some of the purposes behind NASA as well, and what really motivates them in the work that they do. And so, Danny, do you want to maybe just start off by, for those that may not know, introduce them to who NASA are and what the purpose of the organization really is?
Okay, the roots go back to 1915. The Wright brothers invented the airplane in 1903, and there's a long story why, but for the next decade, the U.S. government spent virtually nothing on aeronautical research. The Europeans soon took over, the French particularly. That's the reason why a lot of terms referring to an airplane, like an elevator, an aileron, and such, those are French words, fuselage. And then World War I started, and the United States didn't enter the war right away, but they were concerned we might, and we needed to really catch up. We had an airplane gap, as it were. So they put together a National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, and it existed for the next 40 plus years as a council that kind of guided government research into flight. Now, we got in trouble again in the 50s. In October 57, the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite, and we were way behind. And just like in 1915, we had to catch up, fix that missile gap and everything. And the point was to get satellites launched, get astronauts into space. So they took the existing NACA and they repurposed it. They renamed it. They called it now the National Aeronautical and Space Administration. So now it's not just aeronautical things, but it's also space, and they put it all under one umbrella. And they, of course, pumped a lot of funding into it. And for the next decade, they were consumed with trying to get satellites up, get rockets developed, get men into space. Eventually, President Kennedy committed them to taking us to the moon before the 60s was out. And then after that, they kind of lost their way in many respects, but NASA keeps chugging along, and they've been pushing the manned space program, which is what most people think NASA's all about. But they've been responsible for launching all sorts of things, private and public things. Also, they've been responsible for developing the ISS, and before that, Skylab. They've been the space shuttle for getting us there. Also, a tremendous amount of space probes to the various different planets, Mars particularly, but also Jupiter and Saturn, Venus. And this has been done in conjunction with the universities and also what's called Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL for short. But much of it comes out of funding from NASA's budget. So they've been for 60 plus years the agency in the United States for exploring space. And that's a brief history of what NASA is and how it got to be the way it is.
And is it who funds NASA? Is it the U.S. government, or is it privately funded, or a mixture of both?
It's a U.S. backed the government entirely. They have I think something like a $20 billion budget today, and they've always been one of these agencies that's been supported by the U.S. taxpayers. It's an agency which is a bit different. Most of our government comes under about 15 departments: Department of Justice, Department of Treasury, Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, and so forth. But this one is one of these standalone things. It doesn't have a cabinet secretary answers to. You have a NASA administrator who answers directly to the president and serves at the president's pleasure.
So initially then NASA was all about space exploration, discovering planets. Is that the motive behind much of NASA's work today, or do they have different motivations for what they do?
It's shifted. This is not the same NASA. It keeps changing because the times are changing. Um, and one thing that it's concerned me, and I think concerns many creationists, is in my lifetime I've seen a tremendous shift uh, from just doing space exploration to now being consumed with evolutionary ideas. I really became keenly aware of this. It's been more than a decade ago. I went to one of the semi-annual meetings, a couple of semi-annual meetings of the American Astronomical Society. That's a professional society for astronomers here in the United States, and they have meetings twice a year, as I said, and I go sometimes. And I went to a meeting once, and they had the NASA administrator speaking to us, and I was taken aback because it was all about this thing they called Origins. That was their big program they were running for a couple of years there. And as you went through the exhibit hall, they had all these exhibit spaces consumed with different various space probes to the planets, satellites orbiting observatories, and they're all put under the umbrella of Origins. And the thing was about the possible origin of life, where it came from, origin of stars, the origin of the universe. It was all-encompassing naturalistic explanation for everything. And that was hardly talked at all back in the 60s. In the 60s, it was about studying the way the world as it now exists, what we sometimes call operational science, or more better, we'd say experimental observational science. And now we're getting into origins and historical science, where people are looking for where things came from, not so much how the world now exists, but where things came from. That seems to be the motivation behind everything that NASA's doing. And by the way, NASA also sponsors things dealing with climate change, global warming. That's another big part of the issue, because they monitor the stuff with from space and do funding on that too. So they've become a bit political. It's become kind of trendy, you know, what's going on in society today, and that wasn't what it was all about back in the 60s.
Yeah, and obviously we see a shift in the worldview in society, where I guess in the 60s, even though evolution was probably taught in the school system in the US, I guess society at large was very Christianized, and people still had a belief in scripture and so on. Because I think was it Apollo 8 where the astronauts read Genesis 1? Was that the Apollo mission?
That was, they read the first 19 verses. It was Apollo 8, and it was on Christmas Eve in 1968. I remember that well. I was in ninth grade at the time, and I was kind of surprised to hear them read that. Everybody was. I don't think they really gave an advance warning of what they're going to do. They just did it, and I thought it was very appropriate, because they were first people to orbit the moon. They got first close up by people of the moon, and it just seemed appropriate to talk about creation while they're there, particularly when they finished with the day 4 account, where God made the sun and the moon and the stars. So that was quite a watershed, and made people feel good, basically. There were a few loud mouths at the time that objected. One was Madeline Murray O'Hara. She was a professional atheist that everybody loved to hate at the time. And most atheists at the time just wished she would shut up and go away, because she was such a loudmouth and a jerk about it all. But even that's changed. Our atheists are much more radical than they used to be, much more outspoken. And so if you did something like that today, I'm sure there would be a lot of grief over that, because they really would not want to hear that at all.
Yeah, it'd be hard to think of an astronaut going up into space today and opening up his Bible and reading from Genesis 1. Although we do know some Christian astronauts who've been up there and took photographs and things like that, haven't they?
Yeah. Barry Wilmore is one. Yeah. So there are others and Christian astronauts.
So what would you say the main focus of NASA today, one of their main focuses at least, is trying to find intelligent life in the universe?
Yeah, the whole thing about life elsewhere, that's a question people have had for a very long time, though the question being framed very differently today than it has been in the past. The argument is basically this: okay, if life evolved on this planet, came about naturalistically, then what makes the Earth so special? Why would it happen here and nowhere else? You would have to assume that life originates elsewhere in the universe, and we should be able to see evidence of that elsewhere. So that's been one of the things they've been looking for. And there have been a number of programs, by the way, over the years to look for intelligent life. One of them is called SETI, S-E-T-I. That stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. The first experiment of that was done in 1960. A guy named Frank Drake, he realized that we had been broadcasting radio for about 40 years at that point. Here in the United States, commercial radio broadcast started in 1920. About the same time around the world. This is AM radio. There are other strong signals begin to be sent out. And if you were within 40 light years of the Earth, if you had a very large radio telescope, you could point it towards the sun, which would include the Earth. You couldn't see the Earth necessarily, but the Earth would be there. And if you had a very fine tuner that you could tune down just to one frequency, there's an excellent chance that you could pick up and then amplify the broadcast. You could pick up classic broadcasts of the past. There was a sci-fi movie 25 years ago called Contact, based on a Carl Sagan movie, and one of the signals they got was a rebroadcast, I think, of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. There was Hitler, welcoming everybody to the Olympics, and what they had done is they picked up the broadcast and sent it back towards the Earth. So Frank Drake realized we could flip this around. If other civilizations could eavesdrop on our broadcast, then we could then eavesdrop on their broadcasts. And so what he did is he started listening in on other, pointing towards what he thought were stars that might have planets like the Earth, and had a fine tuner looking for it. And then that SETI was born. And this program has increased over the years, and now there are two programs going on 24/7. They're piggybacking on existing programs. Some of them, others are totally dedicated. And over the years, we've probably generated terabytes of data looking for intelligent signals. Now, they think that they can identify an intelligent signal when they pick it up, and they have algorithms for doing this. And they've gone through terabytes of data probably, and they haven't found any signals yet for all of this. So that's one way you can try to look for life elsewhere, intelligent life, because if you had a civilization like ours anywhere else, it's almost inconceivable that they would not have had developed radio at some point for communication. So that's been zipped. They haven't found anything from that. So people have tried other ways, and one thing you'd like to look for is, well, is there any life that we can find on planets? And for a long time, people held out hope that there could be life on Mars. Percival Lowell was an astronomer 100 years ago who thought he saw evidence of liquid water on Mars, canals, and changing vegetation colors on the planet and so forth. And even though most astronomers at the time dismissed it, it caught the public's fancy quite a bit, and that persisted well into the 60s. And there were other studies that indicated just how hostile the Martian environment was. It was quite a shock in 1965 when the first space probe flew by Mars and sent back some photographs, because many people were expecting almost an Earth-like environment. And what they found was a lunar-like, a bunch of craters on the surface. It was quite a shock to many people, not everybody, but many people. And over the years, we've sent countless space probes to Mars. We've got some rovers on the surface. We've got almost a continual presence now on Mars. This year, we've got some more space probes heading towards Mars. You can go to Mars about every other year, and this is that other year, so we've got space probes going now. And it's funny, every time that they send a space probe, this has been true for over 20 years, maybe 40 years, they always have justification. Why are we going to Mars? And one of the first things they talk about, one of the main things they talk about is let's look for life on Mars. Well, we've done that many, many, many times, and we've not found any. In fact, we found a very hostile environment, very hostile to life. So they said, well, maybe what we ought to be looking for then is not life as it exists on Mars. It may not exist anymore, but maybe we ought to be looking for evidence of life in the past on Mars. You could look for fossil evidence and so forth on it. So to decades now, we keep making the argument, let's go back to Mars because we need to find out if there's life there, if there ever was life there, and if there is, that would tell us something about how life came about on the Earth. There've been early hope for Venus until that was shot down decades ago, and now we've moved outward towards some of the satellites of the outer planets, Europa around the planet Jupiter, for instance. That one is being touted as a possibility. And again, this is against all realistic hope. There's a lot of evidence to suggest there's never been any life on these bodies, but yet they keep talking about it. And I think it's because they feel they have to justify what they're doing. And this, again, didn't happen 50 years ago. This was not the way NASA operated back then. And I think NASA, as I mentioned before, has got kind of political. They've bought into something that's very common in society today. Many scientists argue that the unifying theme of science is evolution. In biology, they say nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that belief has persisted and permeated all the other sciences. In geology, they would argue that you can't understand anything on the Earth unless you understand the past of the Earth, the evolution of the Earth. And they say the same thing about astronomy as well. They're always looking for where did things come from? How do they come to be? Those sorts of things. So I think NASA is reflecting what society is believing and what they're thinking about. They're reflecting this idea that evolution is the unifying theme of all sciences. And when I say evolution, I'm not talking about just biological evolution. I'm saying evolution in the sense of a naturalistic explanation. People believe that the only thing you can consider is naturalistic explanations. That's what I mean by evolution. And again, it gets back to we're looking at planets and so forth. We're studying with space probes. It comes down to if life is unique to the Earth, if life has existed nowhere else in the universe, then that makes the Earth very special. It makes the Earth unique. And that really drags you right back to evolution, because you'd say, well, wait a minute, if the universe is, if the Earth is unique, it's very special, it's the only place that harbors life. Well, why is that? What's the probability that life would exist anywhere then, except, only on the Earth? If it's that exceedingly rare, it must be virtually impossible for life to come about naturally. And of course, I know the answer to that is, of course, that's the reason why Earth is unique in that respect, I believe. So that drags you back to creation, and I think many people get that. They understand that. And if creation is true, if there is a creator, there is a God who's made us, then he has the right to have expectations upon our actions, upon our attitudes, about everything we do. And that then comes down to the condition of sin and righteousness and God's standard, and that brings up the whole issue of salvation. So if something becomes a spiritual issue, and many people say, well, that can't be the case in science. We got to talk about only the naturalistic things. So it's really these huge issues of spirit. It's of the intellect. It's not really a scientific question at all. And this brings into sharp focus the real issues of life. And that's what Answers in Genesis is all about, to offer real explanations and real answers for these kind of questions.
Yeah. Just before I go to my next question, just to remind those that are watching tonight, if you have a question for Danny on the subject of astronomy or NASA, search for life, please put it in the comments section and we'll try and get to it. One of the things I guess NASA are looking for in the search for life, obviously, is water, because we live on the planet Earth, which is covered in 70% water. And they seem to be looking for it either on Mars or, as you mentioned, Jupiter's moon, Europa. Have we ever found liquid water on Mars or Europa? Any evidence that it could have been there in the past?
Yeah, that's a good point. Liquid water is an essential ingredient for life. It's inconceivable that we could have life without water. It's universal solvent. You could do a whole program, by the way, on just how important life is. Water is for life. And we look out in space and we find that water is a very common molecule. It's one of the most abundant molecules in the universe. H2O is. We astronomers find it all over the place. We find it in the space between the stars. We find it in the atmospheres of cool stars. We find it in comets, asteroids. It's all over the place. But one startling realization is that everywhere we detect it, it's always in the gas state or in the solid state, ice. We have yet to detect any evidence of liquid water anywhere in the universe. Now, on Mars, we know that liquid water can't exist because the pressure is too low. It's the atmospheric pressure you would have at about 100,000 feet on the Earth, and the temperature is extremely cold. It's far below the freezing point of water. So if an astronaut were on the surface of Mars and he opened up a container of water and poured it out, a portion of that would boil away right away. A portion of it would freeze, and very quickly the liquid water would disappear. It could not exist. You can have ice, you can have gas, but you can't have a liquid. That's well-established fact. People try to argue that maybe there's liquid water deep inside of Mars. I don't think it's going to work. Was there water ever in the past on Mars? Well, there's water today, but in the solid and gas form, we have abundant record of that. And there's also a tremendous amount of evidence that there was once flowing water on Mars. It was a much warmer and wetter place at one point. In fact, there's a good evidence to believe that there was a very large amount of surface water, like oceans on the surface of Mars. Where did it come from? Where did it go? How did all that come together? I don't think anybody has a good explanation for that. Some people think, well, beneath the surface of the planet, there could be a lot of water still and permafrost. Probably there could be. We don't know. The thing is, can life exist in that condition? And I just don't think it can. They try to argue that maybe life evolved, but then it got kind of froze up, and there might be some microbes still in the soil somewhere after all this time. Now, the other place they really like to talk about liquid water is Europa. It's the second large satellite going outward, orbiting around Jupiter. And it's an interesting world. It's about a 50-50 mixture of rock and ice. And it seems to be differentiated, which means separated, because we think the rock has fallen towards the center for the most part. And then you've got a surface on the top, which is very white in color, very highly reflective. And it appears to be made out of ice, most likely water ice. But people have looked at the surface of this body, and they see certain features that look like the ice in the past has opened up and liquid water's come up and frozen behind it, like pack ice does over the Arctic. You can have these openings develop and water comes up and freezes once again. So on the basis of this and a few other subtle things, people have suggested that there might be substantial amounts of liquid water beneath all that ice. There could be an ocean of water down there. And so then they say, aha, you have liquid water, which is an essential ingredient for life, so therefore there must be life. In fact, 25 years or so ago, when they first made this discovery announcement, one of the scientists involved, he was quoted as saying in the press, "I just know there's life there." Well, that's a belief statement. That's not science. And the reasoning is very sloppy here. Yes, you have to have liquid water for life, and let's just grant for the moment there might be liquid water there. Does that mean there is life? Well, that doesn't follow at all. It'd be like picking up a screw or a bolt, and you know that cars have screws and bolts in them, a lot of them. So you say, aha, I have evidence here that there is a car somewhere. It doesn't follow at all. It's one of those weird things. Just because something's necessary for something else, it doesn't mean that something else exists at all. It's really a kind of gap in logic. They've also been looking at Enceladus. That's one of the satellites or moons of Saturn, and that's because it's volcanically active. Actually, it's geyser active. It's got a heat source inside of some sort, and it causes eruptions on the surface, and the eruptions coming out of the interior has some water. So they're saying, aha, there must be subsurface water in Europa. But we don't know what condition it's in. Is it always liquid water, or is it in a solid phase that somehow gets heated and then gets released? We don't know. But they're seeing evidence that at least liquid water intermittently might exist inside of Europa. So they're now saying that maybe life could exist there. There could be liquid water there. Again, we're not really detecting strong evidence of liquid water anywhere. What we're seeing is indirect evidence. And again, we see it at a gas and a solid phase. And the conditions for life there are pretty hostile. It's going to be very cold in both those bodies. Sunlight probably can't play a role. So people talk about maybe some sort of geothermal heat being the source of energy that could be tapped, and maybe there are autotrophic organisms there, things that don't require, they don't eat on other creatures, they don't rely upon photosynthesis like plants do, and they actually work off of chemical reactions that are falling under neither of those categories that plants or animals do have. And there are a few organisms like that on the Earth. You know, Simon, you could probably remember back when the place they thought life evolved on Earth is first developed were the warm pools. You know, the in the tropics, the nice primordial soup, what they had going on there. But for a number of years now, they've switched. They're looking at environments like geothermal vents, and that's where you have autotrophic organisms on Earth. So now they're thinking this is the place that's going to show us where life is. It's a very hostile environment for life, but you've got something growing there. And I think they've made this shift because they realize that you're not going to find that nice, warm primordial soup pool on these other bodies. You're going to find these hostile places where things are all living on the margins on Earth, but maybe that's the place where everything started. So again, evolution has shifted the thinking on that as well.
Yeah, it seems like a desperate ploy for it to almost be shifted to Jupiter. But going back to Mars and the issue with water, because people may not realize that, but there are canyons bigger on Mars than there are bigger than Grand Canyon, right?
Yeah, you got to be careful though. We believe that's a rift valley. It's not carved by water. It's a big chasm. It's actually as long as the United States is, wide from coast to coast. However, there are canyons dumping into it that look like they've eroded, and some of those are quite large, actually.
So, how would you best then explain the disappearance of water on Mars? Do you have a guess or a theory that you could put to why there is no longer water on Mars?
Well, you know, we creationists have gotten together, and so creation scientists, and tried to talk about these things. I've written a little bit on it, trying to develop a model of solar system astronomy. We see some fascinating things on Mars. I love Mars, by the way. I think it's a great planet, and I like our space probes to Mars. It's you don't need to sell me with all the boilerplate about the origin of life. Mars is a cool planet in its own right and worthy of study. And so, what information we have, it's not clear. If you could wave a magic wand and you could suddenly dump a lot of water and a lot of atmosphere onto Mars, it would persist for a while, but gravity is too weak, and eventually the atmosphere would bleed away, the temperatures would drop, and the water would escape to space or freeze, and you'd be back to where you started from. So how did Mars get to be like that in the past? It could be that Mars was initially created with a warmer, wetter environment, and it rapidly lost it since the creation. Another possibility I've toyed around with is the comparison. I give a talk on this occasionally, where I compare the Earth to Venus and Mars. You've got the Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. They enter 4 planets, and Mars is Venus is actually the closest planet to the Earth. Sometimes we just passed between us and the sun in what we call inferior conjunction, and it was briefly closer than any other planet ever gets to us. That happens every year and a half or so. And the Venus, Mars then is a little farther away, and one of them, Venus, is a very hellish environment. The temperature there is the hottest surface temperature in the solar system. It's actually hotter than the surface of Mercury. And then you go to Mars, and it's incredibly cold, far colder than you find in Antarctica and the most harsh environments there. Mm. So you got these 2 extremes. You got this nice planet in between where we are, and then over here it's way too hot. Over here it's way too cold. It kind of reminds me of the story of Goldilocks. You know, this planet's too hot, this planet's too cold, this planet is just right, a sort of thing. And people sometimes ask me about the purposes of the planets, and I'm thinking maybe Venus and Mars were put there for several purposes. One of them being the contrast. You look at one and you look at the other, and we're right in the middle between, and there's not that big of a difference in distance involved there. And it's almost like the Lord's telling us in this late date, these latter days, that you ought to be able to figure out just how special Earth is, and it's not an accident. It's creation, your design you're seeing here. But it goes beyond that. We believe that not only did God create the Earth, but about 1700 years after creation, because of wickedness filling the earth, the Lord sent a worldwide flood and tremendously changed the surface of the earth and changed mankind forever. And it's a presage of the coming judgment by fire. We know from 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, the what's interesting is the clues we put together from Scripture, and also by modeling this, our creation geologists are convinced that not only was there a lot of water on the earth inundating the surface of the land during the flood, but to do that, you probably needed a lot of tectonic activity, a lot of plate motion, volcanic eruptions, and all this kind of stuff. And most of our creation geologists now believe that during the flood, plates rapidly moved across the surface of the earth and then settled down. Well, if you go to Venus, our study of Venus has revealed that in the past there was rapid plate motion. They think we would disagree with the timescales here, but most secular astronomers, planetary scientists, think that about 150, 200 million years or so ago, the entire surface of Venus was overturned in about 1 million years. The whole thing was completely flipped over. We would shrink that timescale, but that's startling. The entire surface was flipped over. And of course, they would insist that such a rapid thing that happened on Venus could never happen on the Earth. Well, why? And then when you go to Mars, you see an evidence of a global or near global flood on the planet, on a planet where there is no liquid water today. And yet when they go to the Earth, these are planetary scientists who accept the reality of this global catastrophe of water on one time on Mars, but they deny that it could ever happen on Earth. And it's as if the Lord said, okay, for you people, you doubters in the latter days, I'm going to make it possible for your technology to allow you to see that you have plate tectonics rapidly taking place on Venus. You have a global flood or near global flood rapidly taking place on Mars, where, by the way, that I mentioned, there is no water today. And yet you deny that either one could have taken place on the Earth. And a reasonable man, a logical man, a scientific man would kind of get the point there, that maybe that's what purpose these things are serving, and as if the Lord was doing those two processes individually and then showing that it's possible, quite possible, could have happened on the Earth.
Yeah, and there've even, I think, been evolutionary scientists who've recognized that life shouldn't be there. Wasn't it the Italian astronomer Fermi, the famous Fermi Paradox? He said, he did the mathematical equation. He said, well, if they're here, they should be here, but they're not here.
Yeah, that goes back to, I think, 1950 or 1951. He was at Los Alamos lab, and he was having lunch with a couple of friends of his. And at that time, people were talking about alien life. They had the first real big wave of UFO sightings in a couple of years before 1947, and a couple of waves since then. At that point, people, even then, there were some experiments going on, and it was pretty obvious that within the next few decades, nobody thought within the decade, but within a few decades, man would start going into space. So space travel was real. People were thinking about it, talking about it. And then you have to talk about, well, if you have flying saucers coming to the Earth, well, who are these people? Where are they coming from? And all that kind of stuff. So this big discussion was going on. In the middle of this conversation, Fermi just blurted out, "Where are they?" And his buddy said, "Where are who?" and he started laying it out for them. He said, "Look, if there are a few 100 billion stars in our galaxy, and many of those have planets, and many of those harbor intelligent civilizations similar to our own, then what's the probability that we're the first ones to develop space travel?" It gets back to the old argument, the mediocrity principle, they actually call it. The Earth has to be a very drab, normal, humdrum sort of place. We can't be at the top of the class. We may not be the dunce of the class. We can't be the top of the class. So we can't be, life cannot be unique to the earth, nor can intelligent life be unique to the earth. And in fact, we probably are kind of average in just how soon intelligent life developed on the earth. Given that mediocrity principle, then you would expect that there would be perhaps 1 million civilizations out there. 500,000 of them, half of them have already conquered space. Maybe they did it, millions of years ago. So if that's the case, they could start building more and more technology, and they should be able to travel. If they couldn't, they could build these von Neumann machines are called. It could go off and explore space robotically for them. And so if that's the case, then we should have been visited by many times by alien life, yet there's no direct evidence, no strong evidence we have. Despite all the UFO sightings, we still don't have any good evidence. Any of them are visitations from alien civilization. So taking that bit of information, he said, well, where are they? And that is one of three, I think, powerful arguments against intelligent life somewhere in the universe. I think that the Fermi Paradox has become to be called is a very good argument to be made.
Yeah, I do like it when Hollywood tried to do this, that the place they showed up was America, Independence Day.
Well, that's because Americans matter. We're more important than anybody else. And I'm saying that tongue in cheek because, 100 and 200 years ago, the English thought the same thing. So I'm just jabbing the people across the pond, as it were. You had your day, now it's ours for a while at least. And good fun. But yeah, you're gonna do that. I think in Victorian England, a lot of the stories would have been spun around England because that was the top of the heap, as it were, at that time. But that's why we would make them about us. I understand, but well, never mind. Go ahead.
Well, we've had a couple of questions come in. One of them goes back to the purpose of NASA, I guess. And someone's asked, was it a change in leadership in NASA that started the search for life in other planets?
Oh boy, good question. I don't think you could say it was an individual who came in and said, "Hey, I'm going to change everything here." There've been a number of administrators over the years and he doesn't work in a vacuum. There are many people working under him, advising him, with committees and so forth that run it. I think it's a change in the culture, change in our scientific culture, but also the culture in society. That evolution has become a very important concept now to so many people. So I think NASA is reflecting those changes in the way we view science today and the way scientists view science, and that's been the big shift. I don't think there's ever been a single person responsible, setting out to make this as a goal. I just think it reflects this change in attitude we see.
Yeah, and another question is, are there some Christian scientists that believe that life exists in other planets?
Yes, I'll broaden that out. There are Christians who believe life exists. Intelligent life might even exist. I've written about this. I wrote a pocket guide to ETs and UFOs, and I've written some articles and some of my books I've written about it. And every time I write something about it, we hear from people. They email and they write, and they're trying to make the case. There are some scientists I know who are Christians. They may not be six-day recent creationists, but they are Christians and they believe that God created us. And some of them also believe that there may be life elsewhere in the universe. I don't understand their motivation in all of this. I'm really baffled by it. It's interesting. The famous hymn writer Isaac Watts. He's my favorite hymn writer. Some of the greatest hymns ever written. Just when I survey the wondrous cross is one of his. People don't know this, but he also wrote a book on astronomy, and it's went through several editions. He first published it around 1720, I believe. And when I was visiting the UK 2 or 3 years ago, I stayed there with Stuart Burgess in Bristol, and he had a few older books, and I put about a couple of books on astronomy for me to look at, and one of them was the second edition of Isaac Watts' book. It just said I. Watts on the cover. I started looking at it, started reading it, and then I suddenly realized, I said, wait a minute, I know who this is. And I went to talk to him, and I said, you know who the I Watts is here? I said, it's Isaac Watts. He couldn't believe it. I said, yeah, he wrote a book on this. And it's interesting, back in 1720s, people were talking about life on other planets. And
Really?
he believed that there was life on other planets. Now, he's not a scientist, but he was a Christian, very devout Christian man. Yet he believed in planets out there with life on those planets. And it was interesting because he used a verse that I use to make the opposite conclusion. And I thought, whoa, that's interesting. And it's the Old Testament passage about I have made the earth from man that make it to be uninhabited, but to be habited. I did not make it vain, is what it says. I made it to be inhabited, and so I take that as saying, well, God took special favor upon the earth because He was designing it for man's existence. He did not make the earth in vain; He made it to be inhabited. It says. Well, Isaac Watts reached the opposite conclusion by arguing, well, just as he didn't make the earth in vain, uh, if he would have made the earth uninhabitable, it would have all been in vain. The earth would have been in vain. Similarly, other planets, if they don't have life, then they will be in vain. And he made the argument that they must have life as well. And I respect Isaac Watts quite a bit. But I think the problem is here, he didn't realize the emphasis is not on other planets. The emphasis is on the Earth here. He's not saying you can't then apply that to other planets. But I appreciate the fact when I read that for the first time, I understood why a Christian might differ with me on this. I think they're wrong, but at least I could understand a little better why that's the case. And by the way, back at the time of Isaac Watts, we didn't know a lot about other planets at all, the physical conditions. That wasn't possible to be determined then. We can now. And we know that there's not a place suitable for life in the solar system outside the Earth. And so that we've got at least 7 vain planets out there by his own definition. At that time, it was common to believe that Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Saturn, all of them had life. Some people believe the moon had life. Some people believe that there were even beings living on the sun. Today, we laugh at that. But a couple hundred years ago, that was seriously contemplated by many, many people, even some scientists. So it shouldn't be surprising that there are some Christian scientists today, or scientists happen to be Christians, I should say, who believe in life elsewhere.
Okay. A question that I just thought of that came into my head, given that I guess NASA is focused upon evolution and they want to find life in the universe for their evolutionary biases, and that's why they want to go and visit Mars. If Danny Faulkner and other creation astronomers were in charge of NASA from a creation perspective, would you spend all that money to go and visit Mars?
Yes, I would. As I said earlier, Mars is an incredible planet. It's outside of the Earth. It's probably the most diverse, interesting planet. As you mentioned before, it's got this large chasm. It's also got the tallest mountain, and we know about anywhere. It's 70,000 feet tall. It makes Mount Everest look pretty puny by comparison. That's a super volcano. There are other volcanoes. It's got ice caps that's made out of carbon dioxide for the most part. But it's just got a tremendous landscape. It would be tremendous to go there and explore the thing up close. But we can do the next best thing. We can have robotic spacecraft do it for us. So it's worthy of being explored in its own right. And that's true of the other planets and satellites of the solar system. I'm very bullish on this, and I think we don't have to really be heavy-handed about it like NASA sometimes is. But I think I see that these explorations are demonstrating how unique and how fragile the Earth is, and other planets are totally unsuitable for life. I think that's worthy sort of thing to find in itself, because it supports what I believe, largely from Scripture, but not entirely, about what I believe about the prospects of life elsewhere. So if I could be in charge, I would change the message a bit. I would even change some of the programs a bit, but I wouldn't want to say, well, we don't need to go there anymore. It's a waste of time. No, I think it's worthy of going there.
Do you think there are lessons we can learn from visiting other planets like Mars or the Moon that are beneficial for our own planet? Because a lot of people, I think, tend to think, well, it's just a waste of hundreds of millions of dollars. You don't learn anything. What benefit is it for mankind? But is there a benefit?
Well, you're talking to an astronomer who many people would say is following one of the most useless sciences. I mean, what good is astronomy? You can look at biology and you can say, well, there's benefit there. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about this guy is a biologist and he actually did his PhD dealing with insects. And I pointed out to him, I said, there are a lot of I just discovered this a couple of years ago. I ran across this beautiful little fly. And I started asking around about it and looking it up, and I couldn't find anything about it. We don't know anything about its mating habits, what it eats, its life cycle. I thought, that's incredible. It's a common little insect we don't know. And then an entomologist pointed out to me, well, there's plenty of research money for agricultural pests and for vectors of diseases and so forth. There's a lot of money riding on that because it's useful, as it were. There's not a lot of money for the goldback midgefly or something, because they're pretty harmless. And most insects, we don't know much about them at all. It's shocking to learn that, but it's true in the 21st century because there's not any money riding on it. When you get into biology, other areas, you can talk about making better medications and antibiotics and things like this. You get into chemistry, you can make all sorts of useful things that can be used in industry to make things. Even physics has practical applications. So when you get to astronomy, what good is astronomy? Well, it's not obvious it's good for anything, but astronomy, more than any other science, is a lot like an art. It makes people dream. It makes them excited. If you tell people you're a biologist or a chemist or something, they're not that impressed usually. If you tell people you're an astronomer, all of a sudden they light up. That's really exciting. That's way cool. It's about as useful as music is or art, but it's really cool and people get excited, or something about humanity like that. You see, if you look at it in terms of just what things are good for, you're not looking at science properly. The founding document for physics and astronomy, and I would say a good deal of science, is Newton's Principia. But if you look through the contents of the Principia, you don't find anything terribly useful in there. He was simply exploring the question of motion and accelerations and forces and so forth, just because it was exciting and worthy of study. But look what's happened out of that. All engineering stems from that. And engineering is incredibly useful. So we sometimes divide between pure and applied science. Medicine and engineering are applied sciences, and astronomy is about as pure as it gets. But the thing with any science is you pursue it because of the excitement and wonder you have about this creation that God has given to us, and He's given us curiosity and the ability to learn about it. That's how science got started 400 years ago in a very Christian Protestant worldview. And then eventually the details work out. And even in astronomy, we find things. I'll give an example. I think in the 1860s, 1870s, they discovered spectroscopy was being applied to the sun for the first time, really, and studied. And they discovered that there was an element on the sun that was unknown on Earth. That was interesting. What is this weird element? And that for 20 years, they couldn't find it on the Earth anywhere. And they decided they had to call it something. So what are we going to call this? Simon, do you know what they call this new element? Any idea? What's the Greek word for the sun? Helios.
Oh, helio.
And they named this gas, this element, helium. Is helium useful? Oh, yeah, helium is useful for lots of things. But astronomers knew about helium 20 years before anybody did. So that's just one example. There are many, many, many others. Things that you have no idea where you're going. When helium was discovered on the sun, the spectroscopists, the astronomers who discovered that, they had no idea how helium could be used today. There's a helium shortage today. Do you know that? The industry uses it like crazy. It's not just clowns that use that for their balloons and such. There's actually a lot of use for helium and demand for it. So it's very useful, very practical, and that's the way it is. So if we go to the planets, we can learn stuff about them, and many times just developing the technology to do that. The Apollo program was a bonanza of innovation. The first microprocessor, we don't even use that term anymore because computers have become so commonplace and so small. But back then, even a modest computer was the size of a room. The first microprocessor, the first portable computer, was built for the Apollo missions. They needed a computer. It was about this big, and it was not very programmed. I had little switches on it and such, and it had a fraction of the computing power my iPhone has. So that was an innovation, and it actually sped up the development of the home computer. If it hadn't been for the Apollo program, the home computer might have been delayed by a decade. It would have happened eventually, but it might have taken a decade or more before they filtered down to us. So next time you use any kind of computing device, a cell phone or whatever, just think about the Apollo program and where it sped that up. So yeah, you can't divide that stuff.
Yeah, there is a lot of benefit of studying space, and it does bring a lot of joy to people when you see the beauty of God's creation in the universe. Someone has asked another question, Danny. I think Felipe is joining us from Chile. I'm guessing that. I think that might be correct. But Felipe maybe just joined in, but he's asked, I don't know if anyone has already, this has been answered. He said, do you believe in the future, could it be possible to inhabit other planets? He says, if Christ does not return. My question is because there's Christians that say God will not permit that to happen. And it has some eschatological implications.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's possible to do that. You could go there and camp out for a while, which is what we did with the Apollo program. The Apollo program, we sent 3 people to the moon, 2 landed on the moon, and they stayed as many as I think 3 days was the longest mission there. But the whole way there and there at the moon, they were camping out basically. They took everything with them, everything they needed. They had to pack in with them, and that's true of planets in the solar system as well. Probably the easiest place for us to set up a base or spend any time would be Mars. And yet you would have to wear spacesuits outside. You'd have to have energy sources. You have to have a way of providing oxygen to breathe and food and water and everything else. It's the Mars is only marginally better than the moon is when it comes to that. So could we live there? Yeah, we take everything with us and have a contained sort of environment to live in, like we did in the movie a few years ago, the Matt Damon movie, The Martian. They had a closed container they lived in, and then had disastrous things happen. Yeah, The Martian. What did I say? The Martian. And so they had. That's the only way you could do it. You couldn't go there and live like we are here on the Earth. You couldn't walk outside on a nice day like I'm having here or something without a spacesuit on. So yeah, you could go there, but you're not really living on those planets. You're camping out, basically.
Yeah, I think I remember before Stephen Hawking died, obviously because of his evolutionary worldview, he thought this planet would be destroyed through some sort of nuclear war or something. I remember him saying this on the BBC. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us to look for places to live out in the universe. But from what you're saying, that would just be impossible.
Yeah, there's no place in the solar system, and if you could find a planet on another star, how are you going to get there? I mean, the current technology, it would take us a few 100,000 years to get to the nearest star. And how do you build a spacecraft to sustain it? You'd have many generations of people born, live, and die on these things. I mean, that's just inconceivable that this sort of thing could take place. And brings up a good point. They worried about nuclear war. That was the big thing. Now we're worried about climate change destroying the planet. That's now the new imperative, that we need to find a place for humanity to go once we destroy this planet. But if you're committed to evolution, so what? What drives evolution? Well, extinction drives evolution. If you don't have extinction, you can't have evolution. You have to get some organisms out of the way to allow other organisms to take their place. You can't preserve every organism that ever has evolved, otherwise the planet's going to be too crowded. So if people have evolved, then they're part of the process too. And why should we be special? Are we created in the image of God? No, of course we're not. So therefore, we are going to go extinct as well. And if we end up killing ourselves by destroying the planet, then isn't that just a step in evolution? And if we destroyed ourselves, what's the big deal? I mean, we're just animals. There's nothing after the grave. For the life of me, I don't understand why evolutionists get worked up and get really start waxing eloquent over this and get emotional about it, because it's certainly not a rational response. Evolution happens, extinction happens. Live with it, die with it. You know, accept your fate. We're not going to be here forever. And if we make such a mess of this planet, do you really want us messing up other planets? So their own logic defeats their argument.
And I guess actually sometimes I use that as a great witness and opportunity, because I think it shows the inconsistency of the unbelieving worldview, because really what it shows them is that they know life is precious and the image of God is stamped upon them, and it gets fruit. Creation gets fruit of them. And I think that's a good witness until to people. You want to point out the futility of your own worldview, and the reason they want hope is because they realize, eternity is in their hearts.
Yeah.
I think we've been nearly going for an hour now, Danny. I'll just check if someone's, I would prefer heaven than another planet. Someone said.
Well, I didn't catch that.
Someone has said, I would prefer to go to heaven than another planet. So
good choice.
Good choice. Yeah. Is there something you want to end on tonight, Danny, regarding NASA or the search for life beyond the Earth, to leave us with?
Just want to say one thing. I guess I'm just dissatisfied with NASA in a few ways, other than this, and this has nothing to do with the origins question, but I'll get this off my chest. I've thought for a very long time that the space shuttle was a mistake. It really was a mistake. We spent 40 years with the space shuttle, conceived in the 70s, launched in 1981, retired a decade ago. And why do I say was a mistake? Well, the whole point of the shuttle was supposed to make going into space routine, make it very cheap and affordable. And what better way to do that than with a reusable space vehicle that you would fly into space, fly back, turn around like an airplane. When you land your airplane flight, you don't just crush the thing and start with a new one. You refuel it, you clean it, you maintenance, you turn it around and fly it again and again and again. That was the prospect. That was the hope of the space shuttle. Well, we finally, after 10 years of going to the Russians to put our astronauts into space, just a couple of weeks ago, we finally launched. We did it with private enterprise, which is really cool too. A different paradigm here for this. We finally launched people up into the space station. And how did we do it? What did we use? Well, we used a single-use capsule, which is what the space shuttle was supposed to replace a half century ago. That, to me, is a tacit admission that the shuttle was a bad idea. I don't think NASA will ever admit that. But just the fact that they're going back to what we used back in the 60s is all the evidence I need to know that the shuttle was a bad mistake. And the other thing I would mention is the ISS, to me, is a waste. It seems to be a solution in search of a problem. And we have the ability now to send robotic spacecraft. I mean, that's come a long way. And these robotic spacecraft, you can send them at a fraction of the cost. You can send them now without spending years developing the way to do that, to send people. And you can get a lot more bang for your buck with this. So I'm a big advocate of unmanned space probes. And I've gotten to the point now, I just don't think we need to be sending people up for much of anything. I just don't know what the point is of putting people into space other than to get people excited about it. But this is not the 1960s. That ended 50 years ago, and you can't reignite the fascination people had. It's all over. When people talk to me about the space program, I ask them, well, how many Americans are in space right now? Can you name one of them? I don't know how many people we have up there right now. I don't know their names. So I'm not being flippant about it, but I would expect anybody else to be. Back in the 60s, when a space shot went up, most Americans knew who they were. They knew the names, and they had forgotten about them 6 months later, but they knew. I could still name the original 7 astronauts we had. That's been 60 years almost. So times have changed, and we need to change too, I think.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, folks, that's been helpful to you tonight to think about these issues such as NASA, the purpose of NASA, and is there life beyond the Earth? And so thank you, Danny, for giving us that information. It's been really helpful. I know a lot of people in the comment sections have obviously found it interesting and answered some of their questions. So thanks, folks, for watching. And Danny, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
So good night and God bless. Thank you, everyone.